Hello, and welcome to the 91 podcast. Today's guest is a man that I have such great respect for. He's been a voice crying out to Nigerians and Africa as a whole to wake up from the deception that they are under. But, like the Bible says, a prophet is never respected in his own home. Welcome, David Hundeyin. It's nice to have you back with us again at the 91 podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is, since the last time we spoke, what's been happening?
A lot. When last we spoke, I believe that was 2024. I was just transitioning into a sort of full-time engagement as the editor-in-chief at West Africa Weekly after having taken sort of a 6-month hiatus when I went off to try my hand at, having a quiet 9-to-5 job in the UK. And eventually I decided that didn't work out. And I basically I left Europe and came back to Africa and decided to just face this squarely. There have been a few changes. I'm still nominally involved with West Africa Weekly, but not so much. Most of my attention nowadays is with a new venture of mine called The Spearhead, which you may have seen or heard of.
Yes, I have actually. So I've been seeing a lot of posts from them.
Yeah. So that's my brainchild, which I'm very proud of. It took a lot of inspiration from a place that I used to work at, which is called African Stream. And it essentially aims to fill at least part of the vacuum that was created by the demise of African Stream. You know very well how African Stream came to an unfortunate end. An accusation was made without any need for any evidence or anything like that. Next thing you know, they got deplatformed left, right, and center. They couldn't pay their bills anymore, and that was the end of that. So I set up the Spearhead. It is obviously much, much, much smaller than African Stream. It's never going to be African Stream. But if we can get even a tenth of the sort of influence that African Stream had and have even a tenth of the impact that African Stream had, I would consider it to be successful. So that's where most of my energy goes to nowadays. I also do, obviously, because I need to keep the lights on at home. So I do bits and bobs. So you might have seen me on an American news platform called Hotspot. Yeah, so I basically an employee at Hotspot. And I also do some appearances here and there for Sovereign Media. What you would have noticed is that all these organizations that I've mentioned, they all exist in what you would call the alternative media space, the anti-imperial alternative media space. That's where I play fully nowadays. Nowadays, I have very little patience or time or need for conventional media because I've completely given up on it. And when I say conventional media, I'm not just referring to global media. I'm also referring to even Nigerian media. I've kind of completely given up on the conventional platforms in Nigeria for two reasons. The first is that ideologically, they're completely captured. They cannot think outside of the paradigm that they have been indoctrinated in since they were literally children. Because if you think about it, you can draw a line from the indoctrination you received in the name of education as a child in Nigeria or in West Africa, right up until what you think of as media training that you receive when you go into the world as a journalist. It's the same paradigm you're indoctrinated with. There are certain topics that you are not supposed to discuss. There are certain places you're not supposed to go to. There are certain ways you're not supposed to express yourself. There's this sort of arbitrarily defined stricture of what journalism is and is not. That doesn't work for me. And then the second reason I've given up on them is that they're almost entirely funded from outside of Nigeria. They're almost entirely funded from a specific source in Washington, D.C., which makes it impossible for them to hold any positions other than what the preferred party line is in Washington, D.C. So, and I'm not talking about the online conventional platforms only. I'm also talking about even the offline print legacy platforms. So your Punches and your Vanguards and your Guardians, they all ultimately receive their funding from the same source. So I just kind of took a hike, just totally left that space for them. And I just focused entirely on the new media space, which is where I play right now.
So, David, are you saying that most of our media in Nigeria is funded by America?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. And you don't have to take my word for it. Again, this information is on public record. So you could go to these major funding organizations like the Ford Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation or the Omidyar Network or what's the other famous one? The Open Society Foundation, the George Soros thing. They have public pages where you can find out who their grantees are. Go there. And all your Premium Times and your Punch newspaper, they're all there. And the money they're receiving it's in the millions of dollars on an annual basis. So that's where their funding, that's where what keeps them open actually comes from. You know, I used to work in the conventional media space in Nigeria, so I can tell you that for the past decade or so, since the rise of cheap high-speed internet in Nigeria, their business model has been dead or dying. I remember when I was growing up, a typical day circulation for Punch newspaper, which at the time was recognized as the newspaper of the highest circulation in Nigeria, the typical day circulation was something like 300,000. As at 2015, when I was working in public relations, it had declined to 80,000. Right now, it might be even less than that. Possibly will be even less than that. So what is keeping the doors open? What is keeping them operating? It's not circulation numbers. It's definitely not advert income. I can tell you that for free. There's no advert income in Nigeria. You're not going to, if you open media in Nigeria looking for advert income, you're going to starve to death. It just doesn't exist. So what is keeping them open? So you literally just go to these funding platforms and literally just type in these keywords. You find all the information that you're looking for. So again, you don't have to take my word for it, because I've noticed that's a thing that happens in Nigeria a lot. When I say something that some people find unbelievable, unconscionable, and they think, oh, wow, this guy has gone crazy, or this guy is a conspiracy. Meanwhile, this is information that is on public record, if only people would read. So again, don't take anything I have to say for it. Assume that I'm lying and go Google it yourself.
It's just a bit worrying, because if other people are controlling our media, and the media is what, the media has such great influence on us.
Of course
it tells us who to vote for. It tells us what religion to follow. It tells us
it defines your entire frame of reality.
Yes. So if they're controlling our media, then aren't they technically controlling our minds?
There's nothing technically about it. They actually are. It's very direct. The decisions you make on a daily basis are a direct result of the information that you have access to. There was it's not a proverb, but there's a saying which I heard recently that kind of crystallized how this works. The saying is that the most dangerous person in the world is not the person who has his finger on the button that can end the world. And the most dangerous person is the person who controls the information entering the mind of that person who has his finger on the button that can end the world.
Wow.
So regardless of whatever ability or power or whatever it is that you have, whoever is controlling your information is controlling your outcomes. Right? Which is how come in a country like Nigeria, where I'm going to use one very specific thing as an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. In a country where the last two elections that I've held in Nigeria, so 2019 and 2023, we've seen a very specific thing play out, which is that the person who was declared winner, everybody and their dog knows that that person did not actually win the election, but he was declared winner anyway. The issue went to court, and the court gave a completely ridiculous ruling. So if you recall, in 2019, the verdict that the Supreme Court gave was that they're not going to accept the evidence that was being tendered as from the so-called INEC server, because there's no evidence that INEC has a server. If you recall, that was the ruling that was delivered in 2019, that INEC, as far as the law is concerned, INEC doesn't have a server. So even though a server was used in the election process and the information contained on that server can directly indicate as to what actually happened, under the eyes of the law, that server doesn't exist. So they're just not going to acknowledge it. That was the ridiculous ruling that was given in 2019. The secondary ruling that was given in 2019, when the Buhari's legitimacy was challenged, was that so if you recall, the challenge was based on the fact that he never submitted a valid secondary school leaving certificate, which violates electoral law, right? Because under Nigerian electoral law, to compete for president, you have to at least have completed, I believe, 12 years of school. You need to have your SSC certificate. He never proved that he did his SSC, right? And then some certificate pops up from somewhere with a passport photo that is the 70-year-old version of the man, and the name was spelled Mohammed Buhari instead of Muhammadu, which was his name, and somehow it flew. And the court just said, whatever, screw you. And then in 2023, something very similar happened. Again, some incredible amounts of mago went down. We saw people using Tipex on result sheets and all kinds of crazy things happening. And the issue went to court. First of all, the legitimacy of the candidate who was declared winner was challenged. And I was obviously, partially involved in that legal action. And the appeal court, the presidential tribunal, the election tribunal, said, well, in the case of this guy's legitimacy to run for president, that even though we were able to show, based on the deposition from Chicago State University, that this guy submitted a forgery and whatnot, that they're not accepting that. What was the legal terminology that was used? The evidence was not tendered properly. Wow. So they're not going to take it into cognizance. And then with regard to his past dealings as a drug trafficker and the fact that there is legal evidence showing that this guy was involved in drug trafficking, they said, well, it was his bank accounts that were convicted for handling drug money, not him. So it's his bank accounts that were guilty of heroin trafficking, not him. And that flew. So that has happened 2 times recently in Nigeria's most recent electoral history. So that should tell everyone that clearly the issue is not with whether Nigeria is able to produce electable candidates or credible candidates or not. The issue is that the electoral process itself and the entire system of choosing leadership is questionable. The entire system needs to be subbed out. But instead of that being the conversation, what is the conversation in Nigeria right now? The conversation is about electoral reform and electronic transmission and all whatnot. Like little sticking plasters on what is clearly a cancer. And why are we having that conversation instead of the conversation we should be having? The reason we're having it is because the entire media, which is being funded from one specific source, is being instructed to fill people's minds with that one faulty narrative.
Yes.
So instead of looking at the problem for what it really is, you are looking at one small aspect of it and convincing yourself that all you need to do is get electronic transmission of results, and somehow that's going to fix Nigeria. And then if by some miracle you actually get that electronic transmission of results, and then on election day, you now hear that INEC has 2 servers or something, you now start another round of rigmarole again the next time. Then you want to introduce another electoral amendment bill for 2031. And then when they find their way around that one too, and you are just constantly going to be playing whack-a-mole.
They'll find another problem.
This wild goose chase that will never end. instead of reaching the obvious conclusion that the entire system is completely rotten and needs to be torn down, and something new and fit for purpose needs to be put up in its place. But instead of having that conversation, we're having conversations about symptoms. And the reason we're doing that is because the media ecosystem is being controlled from one specific source and is being instructed to fill people's minds with irrelevant and wrong information. So all the conversations, political conversations we're having in Nigeria right now are a direct result of how controlled Nigerian media is, which is why for us to start having the correct and more meaningful conversations that actually mean something to our situation, we need to have a new media ecosystem that is not controlled by these guys, which is the space that people like myself are trying to play in. Now, it might look like, we have some visibility, especially on social media. But the thing is, we are, as a collective, this sort of independent or anti-imperialist media in Nigeria is less than 5 years old. Really. It's a very young thing. So we're going up against an establishment that has decades of presence, right?
And more money than you.
Exactly. Much, much, much more money and resources and connections. And all you have to go up against that is your brain, your creativity, some little social media presence, and a whole bunch of young people around you who you think, if all of you put your heads together and you aggregate your creative and your intellectual geniuses, then you might be able to push back significantly. So it's a very David versus Goliath fight, pardon the pun, but here we are.
And speaking of media, for me, it also feels like social media is controlled. Because Twitter, I wasn't very active on Twitter before, but as I use it now, it almost seems like it's the same narrative being spread. Like people are just pushing stuff like racism constantly on Twitter. I see people like Elon Musk pushing posts that are definitely, obviously racist posts.
Of course.
So I don't know, it just seems like social media, even Twitter, it just feels like there's also something else going on there.
So there's also
some sort of mission.
So the concept of social media, as you know it, is fundamentally a huge, what's the word I'm looking for? Surveillance project, first and foremost. As you may know, Facebook actually began as a US government project before that cover story of some group of students at Harvard came up with the idea in their dormitory, and which is like, all these nice fairy tales that are always tacked onto something after the fact.
That make lovely movies.
Yeah, so like how you hear that two students at Stanford met, called Sergey Brin and whatever, they met and formed Google. No, Google was a fully formed product of the US military, which was then given to these two guys to be the face of it. And now it's this huge multi-billion-dollar corporation, which, I mean, that's how so-called capitalism works, private enterprise. So basically, that's how social media as we know it began. So whether it's Meta, be it Facebook, Instagram, be it Twitter, as you may or may not know, Jack Dorsey, who some people for some reason think was just some whiz kid, who built something in his parents' garage and then it became Twitter. No, that's not what happened at all. And Jack Dorsey is also connected to that secret state in multiple ways. That's another story. But the point is, social media from day one has always been controlled. The only thing that has changed of recent is that the need to hide the level of control has reduced. So it's now more in your face, right? There was a time when Twitter used to routinely deny that there was any such thing as visibility algorithm or shadow banning. They said all those things were conspiracy theories. Now they say it in your face. If you say certain things, your visibility gets moved down. So if you criticize Israel on Twitter, like I do, My visibility has been reduced 82%. Right? There's
82%.
there's a prompt that you can put into Grok to find out how much your visibility has been reduced and why. There was a time this was going around, like maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and a bunch of people did it. And I was among them, and we all saw the results that came out for each person. So it doesn't just give you your reduction score, mine was 82%, it also tells you why. And the primary reason why for me was criticism of Israel. Right? Once you criticize Israel on Twitter, you're done. So I have 1.2 million followers on Twitter, and previously I remember when I had maybe like 600,000 followers. If I tweeted, I'm pulling out my nose hair, within 10 minutes he's hit 5,000 likes, it's 3,000 retweets. I used to be really, really visible. On a daily basis, I think I was doing something like 20 million impressions daily, easily, daily. And then, now that I'm on 1.2 million followers, a couple of years later, under Elon Musk, daily I'm struggling to hit 1 million impressions. Some days it's 400,000. And I have 1.2 million followers, and I have all this visibility, So that's the reality of social media. Same thing on Instagram, on Meta platforms. It is what it is. Instagram, when it was first created, was actually just an independent thing. But that independence obviously couldn't last very long, because first of all, the cost of keeping it going was unrealistic for these two upstarts who created the thing. When it blew up and it had like 100 million users and whatnot, the monthly costs of keeping the infrastructure running and whatnot was running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They didn't have the money, so they were going to have to sell anyway. And then Mark Zuckerberg came with his billions, and basically not just bought it off them, but basically kept them on as employees.
So David, you mentioned mind control. Well, not mind control, but basically control. And I was just, because I saw some posts online, I think from one of your platforms, talking about how the CIA has been using religion basically to, infiltrate Nigeria.
To engineer society, yes.
And I wanted to find out more about that.
Okay, so the platform you're referring to is called Sovereign Media. So for those who haven't seen it, just search up Sovereign Media. They're on all social media, and you probably see the video there. So the central thrust of that video was that the faces of Christianity and Islam that you're most visually familiar with in Nigeria and across much of the global South are not the original faces that existed maybe 50, 60 years ago. That these faces you are seeing are the direct creations of foreign intelligence, specifically CIA. Again, this is on public record. This is the CIA's own declassified documents, which most people just will not read, even though it's literally available for free on the open surface internet. You can literally Google it. It's on the CIA's own website, but for whatever reason, people their eyes just glaze over once they see anything that has paragraphs in it. They just don't want to read.
Yes.
The CIA itself admits that during the Cold War, for those who don't, because believe it or not, there are people who don't know what the Cold War was. The Cold War was an ideological conflict between two economic schools of thought. So capitalism on the one hand and communism or socialism on the other hand. And the primary bulwark for communism or socialism back then was the USSR, the Soviet Union. So back then, in the name of fighting communism, which was the CIA's primary role during the Cold War, one of the tactics that was deployed was to engineer societies in the global South. Bear in mind, I should have mentioned this, the primary battleground of the Cold War was the global South. So the Cold War wasn't fought in the US, and it wasn't fought in the USSR, and it wasn't fought even in China. The Cold War primarily was fought in Africa and across, Latin America and parts of Asia, the so-called global South. That's where the Cold War was fought. There was like an ideological clash of civilizations in our part of the world. So one of the CIA's tactics for winning the Cold War against communism was that the religions that Africans or people in South Asia or in the Middle East or in Latin America adhere to, that these religions should be transformed into information vectors that could be used to defeat communism, right? So what was the primary conflict between communism and capitalism? The primary conflict was the conflict between the idea of individual profit versus collective social good. Now, it was a lot more complex than that, but if I'm boiling it down, what was the ideological difference? That was it. So if you're fighting on the side of individual profit against a philosophy that talks about collective social good, what do you want to inculcate in the minds of your target audience? If you want them to pull away from anything that deals with collectivism or mass, group action, so things like unions, things like pressure groups, collectivist political parties, that sort of thing, trade unions, student unions, those kinds of things. How do you make people draw away from that and move toward a more individualist way of thinking, which favors capitalism? Well, one of the ways you could do that, which the CIA very successfully demonstrated, was that you can weaponize their religion. So back then, in the 60s and 70s, the primary face of Christianity, which was Catholic, was something called, in the global South, was something called liberation theology. Now, liberation theology was developed in Latin America, and it was basically a form of Catholicism which centered around encouraging the oppressed peoples of the world, the people living in the post-colonies, or the neo-colonial territories of the world, to rise up against their the puppet governments that have been put in place by powers from the global north, to take collective group actions to better their lives. And in addition to encouraging collectivism, this so-called liberation theology also borrowed very heavily from Marxist literature to carry out social analysis. So basically the vehicles through which liberation theology became popular across the Christian global South made heavy use of social analysis that was taken directly from the writings of Karl Marx and people like him. So use of terms like comprador elite or terms like bourgeoisie, like these are ideologically Marxist things, and liberation theology borrowed very, very heavily from these things. So obviously, the CIA saw liberation theology as primarily communist, so it saw it as a threat. So how liberation theory was taken down was that the CIA then funded the rise of a different form of Christianity, what you know today as the evangelical church or the prosperity gospel, right? So it's a form of Pentecostal Christianity. It's a form of Protestant Christianity. This so-called Pentecostal thing, which basically told people that the solution to their problems was not necessarily to be found in mass actions, group actions, collectivist things, that the solution to their problems was to be found primarily in their individual, their faith in God as individuals. This newfangled form of Christianity, this completely contrived thing, basically instructed people that instead of seeing the world through the lens of group or mass or collectivism, that they should rather see it through an individualist lens. So if you are looking for solutions to your problems, God wasn't going to solve your problems as a group. God was going to solve your problems on an individual or a personal basis. So instead of using Christianity as a base for galvanizing a group to come together to take material actions to better their environment, such as uh, carrying out a revolution against a corrupt or a puppet leader, or building, taking contributions from a community and using it to build a health center, material actions that are rooted in collectivism. Instead of that, what you needed to do was, for example, pray for God's individual blessings. And God will solve your problems individually. He would bless you individually. So if you you needed money to pay for your tuition, for example, like to have a better life, you needed an education, but you didn't have the money to pay for the tuition. God could bestow his blessing on you to pay for that tuition, as against everyone who was in that situation together, coming together to take political action that would lead to tuition being made free or cheaper so as to be accessible to everyone. So that was the primary difference between what liberation theology taught and what this prosperity gospel taught. Prosperity gospel taught primarily that one was to see oneself as an individual moral agent searching for individual salvation in many ways. So salvation in terms of your material conditions, salvation in terms of your religious salvation, all of that was an individual pursuit now under this newfangled form of Christianity. And you have to say it was extremely successful, not just in terms of how quickly it spread and how popular it became, but in terms of how completely it re-engineered societies around the global south. So you might have had parents who were alive during the during the pre-independence and the immediate post-independence era. And what they will always tell you is that the country they remember then, the society they remember then, that it just doesn't exist anymore. Have you ever wondered why that is? That obviously technology can change, a few things about a society can change, but how is it that the moral essence, the entire moral fabric, the intellectual core and beating heart of a society, how does it completely flip in like 40 years? How does that happen? And the answer is that the things that society holds most precious and most dear to its identity, such as, for example, the religion that it practices, whoever can morph that religion has morphed that society. That's what happens to Nigerian society. That's the biggest part of the reason why Nigerian society was so fundamentally morphed. So the Nigeria that existed in 1966 and the Nigeria that existed just 24 years later in 1990 were two completely different worlds, completely different societies. That was what happened, right? The religious backbone of the society was completely morphed. So instead of being collectivists, you were trained to be an individualist. So if you pray and sing and dance and wind your waist in church and give money to the church enough and show enough personal faith and devotion, up to and including donating vast amounts of your time and effort and whatnot, which is partly where you got all these sort of cult-like pseudo-Christian groups popping out of the woodwork. That was also the period when they all became vastly popular in Nigeria. That wasn't by accident, and across Africa. So your Mormon church and your Jehovah's Witnesses and whatnot, if you notice, it was during the 1970s that they all started popping up out of the woodwork in Nigeria. Previously, these were niche religious movements in the US. But in the 1970s, there was this mass migration of these movements into sub-Saharan Africa, and they became vastly popular here. That was not by accident. It didn't just happen. It was deliberate, and the US government assisted them every step of the way. And the goal ultimately was to win the Cold War, which was primarily an ideological war. And it succeeded. It succeeded very, very much. And by the way, this didn't just happen to Christianity, which was also the point that I made in that video. This was also done with Islam. So again, if you were to ask an elderly person in northern Nigeria to describe the northern Nigeria that existed in 1957 versus the one that existed in 1991. Again, there'll be two completely different countries, even though that's barely 30 years apart. Why was that? Yeah. The reason was, again, as part of the Cold War, the calculation was made by the US government that the type of Islam or the form of Islam that was practiced across the parts of the global south where Islam was practiced, primarily ideologies like Sufism or Shiite Islam, that these Islamic ideologies were kind of similar to liberation theology. I don't know if you're familiar with this or how close you were to maybe Muslims growing up in Nigeria, but there's actually a very strong egalitarian ideology in Islamic theology. So, for example, it's where if take your typical Pentecostal Nigerian church, where who sits in front is often an economic and political question, right?
Yes.
In your typical mosque, even under the perverted form of Islam, which is practiced across much of Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa today, your typical mosque till now, it is unheard of for the people who worship in front or who worship at the back to be determined by your material status. Till today, that's pretty much unheard of. That's a holdover from the fact that Islam itself had some very egalitarian tendencies, which is not to say that Islam was this like perfect religion. There is no such thing as a perfect religion. As you well know, I myself am not a religious person by any means. Yes. But the point is, there were some parts of that theology that were considered by the US government to be a threat. Because by espousing egalitarianism, which is the flip side of collectivism, you are basically saying that the group comes before the individual. And the basic tenet of capitalism is that the individual always comes before the group. Right? So if you're trying to win an ideological war that prioritizes the individual above the group, then you need to either get rid of any philosophy that espouses collectivism or pervert it and subvert it in such a way that it becomes useless or it does the opposite. And the same thing was done to Islam. So in the 1970s, a deal was struck with Saudi Arabia, where it's what you now know as the petrodollar deal, where Saudi Arabia basically became the most important vassal state of the US, which is why Saudi Arabia is completely untouchable today, which is why all this talk about democracy or whatever never gets to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia it's not possible to criticize Saudi Arabia. You cannot see criticism of Saudi Arabia in popular American media. There's a reason for that. And the reason is this deal that was struck in the 1970s made it such that in exchange for making Saudi Arabia or the Saudi royal family among the wealthiest people on earth and the most protected and bulletproof people on earth, Saudi Arabia would price its oil in US dollars. Obviously, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest producer of oil. So by pricing its oil in US dollars, that effectively made the US dollar the global reserve currency and made the US the de facto, undisputed world power. One of the caveats to that deal was that the US and the Saudis then began to cooperate with regard to winning the Cold War on behalf of the US. So one of the things that was done was that the US State Department, which is basically CIA with extra steps, right? The US State Department collaborated with the Saudi government to create certain ideological organizations that basically went around colonizing the Islamic world. The most popular one of these organizations is called the Muslim World League. If you don't know what the Muslim World League is, you can just Google it. So it was a Saudi organization which was formed in the 70s, and basically what they went around the world doing was spreading this very niche form of Islam called Wahhabism. So prior to mid to late 70s, Wahhabism basically didn't exist outside the Arab Gulf. It was a very, very niche form of Islam that most Muslims they did not rate it, right? Most most of the people that you call Sunni Muslims today, including those across West Africa and whatnot, where the type of Islam they were practicing was primarily Sufi Islam. Now, Wahhabi Islam was a completely different matter entirely. So where Sufi Islam was kind of generally benign, or sort of, what's the term that I'm looking for? So if you know anyone who lived in northern Nigeria, maybe prior to the 70s, who lived there in the 50s and the 60s, many of our parents grew up in northern Nigeria, because at the time when Nigeria was trying to develop like a national identity, and then these federal government colleges were built around the country, and people went to boarding schools around, many of our parents spent a lot of time in northern Nigeria. My dad did his youth service in Sokoto State. And the only reason he didn't stay and settle down there after finishing was that he wasn't offered a permanent government contract in the civil service job that he was doing. He was offered an annual contract. And he decided that no, he wanted more stability than a 12-month contract. So he decided to go back to Lagos. If not, he would have settled in Sokoto, and my name might be Malik or something like that today, right? This was a common thing. And what they will always tell you is that at no time did they ever feel like, bear in mind, my dad was a Christian, right? At no time did they ever feel like they were under threat, or that there was any sort of aggression toward them coming from the local Muslim population, or that there was any problem. The local population was Muslim, they were Christian, and it was never a problem. There is emphasis placed on basically peaceful coexistence and living and letting live. Under Wahhabism and its twin brother, Salafism, both of which are the ideologies that are linked to all your ISIS's and Boko Harams and AQIMs and JNIMs and all those other, multiple letter entities. Under this ideology, people are categorized into who is a true believer and who is, what's the term for it? Who is an apostate or an unbeliever. So the concept of takfir is something which became a whole thing under Wahhabism, whereas under Sufism, the Sufism that our parents grew up in close contact with all over Nigeria, there was never any problem with people getting along. Once Wahhabism was introduced to all these Islamic societies across the global south, that is where your problems began. So in Nigeria, we first started seeing this problem. I did a story about this in 2021. That story was called Conflicts for Jihad, the Boko Haram origin story. I think that story actually didn't go far enough, because the story I think it described 70% of the problem and didn't really do a good job of, of going through the remaining 30%. What that story laid out was that this Muslim World League came into Nigeria. Its funding and its supports and its scholarships that it awarded to Quranic students and whatnot from Nigeria were instrumental in creating what we now know today as Jibwis, or the Izala Society, which is essentially, to all intents and purposes, the founding block of what we know today as Wahhabism or Salafism in Nigeria. And that is where the problems came from. Because as soon as this organization took root in northern Nigeria, that's when you started having your Maitatsine crisis. That's where you started having regular religious, clashes and pogroms and whatnot. And that's where ultimately the pipeline that created what we know today as Boko Haram and its many offspring, that's where it came from, which was laid out in that story. Why I said maybe I didn't do a good enough job of exploring the problem in that story was that in that story, I only explored how the pipeline of Islamic or Islamist violence in Nigeria can be drawn back to Saudi Arabia. And I didn't make the point well enough that Saudi Arabia in and of itself is not the ultimate source, that this was just a Cold War strategy which was incubated in Saudi Arabia on behalf, ultimately, of the US government. So essentially, all roads lead to Washington, D.C. It's an empire, right?
So what you're saying is that So you're basically saying that the country which prides itself in being a Christian nation, which is trying to go and save and liberate Christians around the world, is the same country that technically created Boko Haram in Nigeria.
It didn't just create Boko Haram in Nigeria. Pretty much every significant Islamist terror organization that you're familiar with anywhere in the world, using publicly available information, you can draw it back to the US. So whether it's ISIS, which is basically a creation of Operation Timber Sycamore under President Obama, again, public information. You don't have to take anything I'm saying for it. Literally Google Operation Timber Sycamore and see what I'm saying. It's on Wikipedia. That's how freely available this information is. It's everywhere. So Operation Timber Sycamore, which was essentially to create a rebel army in Syria for the purpose of toppling the Syrian government as part of this permanent empire-seeking quest that the US and its Israeli sidekick are on. That was what created what became known as the Free Syrian Army and then ISIS. It's on public record.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you know this information, then that means our government must know some of this information, right?
Well, I mean, of course it does, or it should, but if the question that you're then going to ask is, so why don't they do something about it? Then that goes to the heart of the issue. The issue is who put that government there? Who does that government work for? Is that government sovereign? Is it independent? And then you start getting to the heart of these more fundamental questions, which is why I said earlier that control of information in Nigeria has trapped all of us in this weird sort of alternate reality where we are debating things that don't matter, or we're debating specific aspects of problems instead of seeing the wider context that they exist in, which is why some people will think that the solution to terrorism in Nigeria, terrorism which is 100% a US government creation in Nigeria, that the solution to that terrorism should be to then invite the US military to come and fix the terrorism problem to
save us
that the US government created. But that's because, again, there's control over the local information space in Nigeria. So the only Nigerians generally who even know any of these issues that we're talking about are Nigerians who have left Nigeria for a significant amount of time and have interacted with other information systems. So they are no longer trapped within the Nigerian information space, or Nigerians who, for some reason or the other, have been able to psychologically disconnect themselves from Nigeria's information space and seek knowledge outside of the bubble that they've been psychologically trapped in. Those are the only two groups of Nigerians who even have any idea of these issues that we're talking about. There's an entire generation of Nigerians who grew up with access to cheap, high-speed, reliable internet access, and to whom all of this is just conspiracy theory. Because even though literally all of this information is a Google search away, and we have the same Google that someone in Arizona or Jeddah or Brisbane has, somehow we don't use it the same way. So there's a whole generation of Nigerians who have been raised to think of the internet, which is the world's information superhighway, as a place that you go to be entertained, or a place that you go to make money. And they don't really see the internet beyond that. They don't really understand the value of what they're holding. And if you're to tell them that the days of having an open, relatively free access internet, those days are rapidly coming to an end. And there will come a time when the internet itself is going to be fragmented across multiple power blocks, and different groups of people will not have access to different types of information anymore. And that Africa is essentially, at its current trajectory, is going to end up being at the mercy of another group's, information apartheid. They will not understand what you're talking about. Because it's like we live in different worlds. So here we are.
What you're saying is a bit scary because, for the past year, I've come to understand this. Well, I might be wrong, but it feels like Africa has no friends.
Africa has never had any friends. At best, Africa has, what's the term I'm looking for? Has temporary alignments, which are useful. but they're always temporary. And it's not just Africa. Just that's geopolitics. That's international relations in a nutshell. Nobody has any friends. People only have interests. I think Africans are the only people in the world who think that they have friends or that they should have friends. Nobody else is burdened with that expectation, which is why, for example, when you see this talking point being deployed, and I've been a victim of this, where you say, "Oh, someone is he's pro-Russia or he's pro-China," and that's somehow intended to be a slur. Someone is pro-Russia. So essentially, what you're saying is, a sovereign entity should somehow not be allowed to even think about the possibility of engaging diplomatically or economically or geopolitically with whichever entity that it sees fit, so as to improve its own place in the world. That even though you are already on your knees, right? Other people are on their feet, you are on your knees, and your only problem should be how to get up on your feet like others. You are rather focusing on tying one hand behind your back instead of using every leverage that you have at your disposal to get onto your feet. So you have an African saying, Putin is an imperialist, or they don't have democracy in China, or North Korea is a brutal dictatorship. How is that your business? You are hungry. You don't have food to eat. That's a bigger problem than anything they have in Russia, China, or North Korea. Don't you think? You don't have lights. You don't have roads. You don't have hospitals. You don't have schools. You don't have factories. Your internet access is at the mercy of other people. We claim that we have this fiber optic thing, we have main one cable. All of these things are controlled by white people. We don't control anything. All our banking infrastructure, I know it's built on other people's technology, other people's backends, other people's IP. The day they decide to send us back to the Stone Age like that, we don't have any control or leverage to stop it. So in this situation and in this condition, the only thing we should be concerned about is using whatever leverage we have whatsoever with whoever to get to where we want to be. It doesn't matter who that is with. Whatever you think about that person, think about the most abhorrent, morally repugnant country or civilization in the world, and think about all the people that have all sorts of economic and diplomatic relationships with them. So if all those people are allowed to have those relationships, why is it not Africa where someone will now say, oh, there's some group of people that somehow by default you are not allowed to even think about the possibility of cooperating with these people? That somehow it's the people that enslaved and colonized you for 500 years. Those are the people that are supposed to tell you who you are supposed to be friends with, how you are supposed to run your economy, on what terms you are supposed to choose leadership, and how you are supposed to run your governance. Why? But again, that's what control of information sources does to people. People don't know what they don't know.
Mental control. Do you think that we can trust maybe Russia or China?
You don't need to be able to trust anybody. The only person you need to trust is yourself, your interests, and what your own strategy is. So again, when you use a word like trust is indicative of the relationship you have with a friend or a family member. Nobody's your friend, nobody's your family member. Everybody just has interests. So Russia has interests that happen to be well aligned with African interests right now. China has interests that are aligned with African interests right now. So you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. You get it while the getting is good. You take what is on offer. And most importantly, you focus on what your own strategy is for making use of these things while you have them. Because even Russia and China have fought amongst themselves multiple times. So you might have heard of the famous Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s, where once upon a time, Russia and China were like 5 and 6, right? China's initial technology starter kit, if you like, came from the Soviet Union. So the technology that helped China to develop a nuclear weapon was Soviet technology, right? Once upon a time, they had a very close diplomatic relationship. And then there was a diplomatic split. There was a period of isolation from each other. And then eventually, when the situation demanded a thaw in relations, there was a thaw. And then there was another split again. Between the late 90s and the early noughties, there was a bit of an issue, especially over military contracts. And then again, when the situation demanded it, after the war in Ukraine broke out, again, there's been a significant thaw, and the both of them have, integrated their economies greatly with each other because they've realized that they need each other to survive, because the greater threat is the US empire. So they need to create alternative trade routes, they need to create alternative banking and transaction systems and alternative global reserve currency and all of that. That's how international relations work. It's not on the basis of friendship. It's on the basis of shared interests. So currently we have shared interests with Russia and China. So we should explore that relationship to the fullest extent possible because of those shared interests, on the basis of those shared interests. That's how international relations and diplomacy works everywhere. I don't know why Africans, well, let me not say I don't know why. I do know why. It's because, again, information has been, the control of information has been structured in that way. But Africans need to lose that destructive idea that cooperating or collaborating with another sovereign entity is somehow a thing of friendship or emotions. That has nothing to do with it. Russians, half the time I spend speaking out on social media, you might see me, taking shots at white people, for example. But then Russians are also white people.
Yeah.
However, I don't see the contradiction there, right? Because they don't have to like me as an individual, as a human being. I don't have to like them as individuals or as human beings. We just need to be aligned. We need to have shared interests, right? Our interests are shared. I've explained this thing multiple times, but I'll explain it again for the benefit of those who have been sitting at the back of the class.
So David, are you saying that we should ignore like the videos we saw online of Russians using Africans, as cannon fodder?
Again, this feeds into what I was saying about information control. So I don't know if you saw this a couple of days ago, but it actually emerged that entire thing you saw about Africans supposedly going to fight a war on behalf of Russia in Russia and they're getting captured by Ukraine and whatnot was actually Ukrainian army propaganda. So I don't know whether it happened or it didn't happen, but the point is the source that it came from was the Ukrainian military.
Wow.
So again, you always have to sort of question the information that is getting into your mind. Who is paying for this information to get in front of your eyeballs, and what is the reason for it? Now, it's entirely possible that those things actually did happen. It's entirely possible that people actually did sign up to go to work in Russia and then got deceived and went to the war front and whatnot. It's entirely possible that it happened. But the point is, why did you hear about it? Who put that information in front of you and why? And has the reverse also happened? Have Africans gone to fight on behalf of Ukraine, and have they gotten captured by Russians or even killed by Russians? And did you hear about that? And why didn't you hear about that? Who didn't pay for that information to be put in front of your eyeballs? So, these are the questions.
Wow. And I noticed you recently spoke about immigration, and you had a take on it, which I had never heard before, saying that immigration was vital for the empire. I was just, not to make you repeat everything again, but I'd like you to talk about that a bit, if you don't mind.
What I was saying was that immigration, most people, when you say that immigration is part of the process of running an empire, the first thing that comes to mind automatically is, well, yes, because of cheap labor. Yeah. And that is true to a large extent, but sometimes it's also more than just cheap labor. There's a much more important use for immigration in terms of running an empire. And this is not something which was invented recently. This is something that goes back to Rome. The Romans used to do something similar. whenever they would invade a territory and then they would basically colonize it, turn it into a Roman territory, what they would do is that some of the noblemen or the royal members of the royal family or the intelligentsia or the elite from these places that they had just invaded, they would actually take them as prisoners of war, right? They would take them to Rome. And what that would ensure is that if you don't want anything to happen to these people, then you people had better remain calm, because essentially these are basically hostages. So if you people start a disturbance, these will be the first people to die. And that was one of the ways that they maintained stability in the Roman Empire. So in addition to taking away noblemen from the colonial territories, the imperial territories, and using them as hostages, something else they used to do to great effect was that they would take the best and the brightest of the societies of these places that they invaded, that they colonized, and they would basically train them to become Romans. They would give them Roman citizenship. They would learn the Roman language, the Roman culture, the Roman religion, and they would basically become Romans. And then they would set those ones up as the sort of how do I put it now? The cultural aspirations for the people in those territories to look up to. That we have been conquered by Rome, and now our best and the brightest have become Romans. That essentially, if you want to be something in life, then you need to assimilate into the Roman way of life, right? So immigration has always been weaponized in some way, shape, or form by empires. The current global North Empire is doing something similar. The example that I gave in the video that you're referencing was Nigeria in 2015. Now, as you know, there was a Western-led regime change operation in Nigeria in 2015, which led to basically the total falling off of Nigeria as an economic entity. So from number one in Africa, growing at 7% annually, it's nowhere and going nowhere fast. It's now number 4, almost number 5 in Africa. The currency value has fallen off a cliff. Earning a purchasing power has fallen off a cliff. Per capita income now, even by African standards, is now very poor. So you have a situation where Nigeria is now almost 3 times poorer than Ghana per capita. That's just how, and Ghanaians would not think of themselves as particularly well-off people, but Nigeria is like nearly 3 times worse. That's how bad it is now. That happened as a result of that regime change operation, which was a deliberate action that was taken. Now, in the aftermath of that regime change operation, what happened? What happened was that the British government, which took part in that regime change operation, which was the central player in that regime change operation, what they then did was that they opened up what looked like an easy pathway for Nigerians to migrate to the UK. Previously, it used to be very difficult to migrate to the UK. Previously, the process and the time and the cost implication of migrating to the UK was prohibitive. I know this because I was once in and around that space. I lived in the UK for a certain number of years. I went to school there, I worked there, and even just the requirements that were needed just to remain. I could have stayed if I wanted, but I looked at those requirements and I just thought, like, where does it end? I'm just going to be on a treadmill for an indeterminate period of time, and this is not going to stop. And why am I doing this to myself? Like, am I coming from a place where there's a war going on or something? Like, I have a home to go to. Why am I putting myself through this? And I basically just got on a plane in March 2013, and I just went back to Nigeria, right? That's how it used to be. Now, from 2016, which was conveniently just around the exact time when Nigeria's economy has started falling off a cliff. If you remember, Q1 2016 was when Nigeria officially went into recession. The economy that had been growing at 7% annually, that was the 3rd fastest growing economy on earth in 2015. By Q1 2016 was in full recession. Businesses had already started closing up. Things were already starting to fall into the gutter. Coincidentally, at that exact same time, the UK opened up the immigration floodgates that used to be very tightly shut. All of a sudden, there was this pathway that didn't exist before, where you could say that you're going to do a master's program. You wouldn't have to pay for the whole program. You just pay a deposit, maybe £2,000, or in some cases, 1,500. You just pay that deposit, and then They would ask to get the visa, you just had to show a certain amount in your account. And there were several backdoor ways of getting that. There were ways of getting so-called proof of funds. So you would pay someone to lodge a certain amount of money in your account for a certain amount of time. And all you had to do was just present the bank statement to the UK VI and you'd get your visa. Obviously, the UK government is not stupid. They know very well that money is not yours. But they intentionally made it such that, you just have to show this money in your account and it has to be there for a minimum of 28 days. There was a time when a similar visa application, you would have to show that money had been in your account for at least 6 months. They conveniently lowered it to 28 days. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that people were going to try and cheat the system. So in actual fact, nobody cheated the system. They did exactly what you wanted them to do, right? So you would then go, you would get your visa, you would move to the UK, you could work during your master's degree program. After you finished, you automatically have 2 years to remain and do whatever work you could find. And then either you would then get the kind of sponsored white collar gig that you wanted, which would then allow you to stay and then get your indefinite leave to remain after 5 years. Or more likely you wouldn't find such a job and you will end up going into care work, which would also allow you to stay for 5 years and get your indefinite leave to remain. So they created this whole pipeline of master's degree to care work to ILR, right? They even came up with a name for it eventually. So if you've heard of the term Boris Wave, right? Boris Wave is literally that entire class of immigrants that came from sub-Saharan Africa, primarily Nigeria, between 2016 and 2023 or thereabouts, or 2022. There's a name for it in British politics. It's called the Boris Wave, right? They know exactly what they did, right? So essentially what they did was that all of the people who had the potential to create political disruption in Nigeria during that period, they gave those people somewhere to escape to. So they created a new visa category called the Global Talent Visa. So all the artists and intellectuals, all of them left. And then, the people who had the potential to, just by virtue of their dissatisfaction and their expectations, because they were educated white-collar professionals who were being ground into poverty, those are the kind of people who eventually would have erupted into anger and something would have happened. They gave all of them a way to escape. They gave them, okay, you can just find some money, go, apply for a master's degree, move here, work in a care home, put up with whatever you have to put up with for 5 years, and then you have your indefinite leave to remain. And after another year, you get your British passport, and then, even if you end up wasting the rest of your life working in a care home, at least your children will be British citizens, and they will have access. They will have access to, supposedly have access to this, the entirety of British society, which is a lie. They will never have that access. Any Caribbean will tell you that, because the exact same scam was pulled on them during the so-called Windrush immigration era. But anyway, that's a different story. So that's exactly what they did. They weaponized inward immigration. And they did this despite the fact that British people have made it abundantly clear for the longest time that they do not want black and brown people around them.
Yes.
As far back as 2008, when I was a first-year university student, I was an international student. I wasn't an immigrant. I was paying £15,000 a year just to be there, right? So I was on a visa. I was just there to go to school. And even then, I could feel the hostility just by virtue of my skin color. These people do not like you. They don't want you there.
It's worse
the
now.
government knows, and yet keeps importing black and brown people. Why does it do that? Why would it do that? If it knows very well that the British public is not on board with mass immigration, why does it keep importing black and brown people? It's because it's deliberate. It's part of the process of running an empire. To keep the imperial territories pacified, those territories that you are extracting from, right? And that extraction is what underpins the wealth of your entire colonial enterprise. To keep those places pacified, you need to take away the people that are going to cause disruption in those places. The best and the brightest. The most educated people, the most qualified, the people who they might not necessarily be rich, but they have some amount of liquid capital, those people who it is in their best interest for them to have a stable country around them, and then your actions have pulled the rug out from underneath the country that they're in. Those are the people who are going to, when they're sort of find themselves taken from comfortable middle class, I'm able to travel once a year to Dubai, and all of a sudden I find myself in a situation where I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent or pay my children's school fees or eat. Those are the people who are going to cause problems eventually.
Yeah.
So when you give that class of people an escape route, then you ensure that colonial territory will remain pacified. The only people that will be left will be the ultra rich, who are never going to move anyway because their wealth is tied up with the system that exists, right? And they're your friends too. And the poor, who don't have any power and who don't have any way of incubating a revolution. They are poor, they're uneducated, they have no access to capital. They're just placeholders, really. They might as well not exist.
Do you think this, the destabilization of nations is just all about, these global powers making money? Or do you feel like some part of it might have some hidden racism in it?
Racism is fundamental to how they operate anyway. The idea that somebody's life is worth less than your money is fundamentally a racist idea to begin with. The idea that you can destabilize an entire country and ruin millions of people's lives simply because it's going to boost your Q3 profit margin is a fundamentally racist idea. So yeah, racism is, you can't separate the Western capitalist mindset from Western racism. You can't separate them. They're part of the same monster. One can't exist without the other, right? For the racist mindset to exist, there needs to be that extractive capitalism, because that's how the racist justifies itself. That it must be superior because look at the way it lives and look at the way everybody else lives.
Yeah.
So it must be superior. And for the Western capitalist mindset to exist, the racism has to exist because it has to justify itself that, in order for me to maintain this inflated standard of living, this artificially inflated consumption that I have, this group of people has to be beneath me. That's just the way it has to be. That's the way God surely intended, right? So, which is why you will find out that the people that I would consider to be the worst racists in the world, and this goes back as far as the 15th or the 16th century, those people are not the people who were on the plantations whipping black people. Those people are not the people who were lynching black men and women all over the New World and feeding black children to alligators and whatnot. Those are not the people who were eating black people and using our skin as leather. Those are not the worst racists. The worst racists were the people who were sitting in bank and insurance company boardrooms, who were creating financial solutions that were built off the back of commoditizing the lives of African people. So this gentleman owns a ship, and that ship is going to be used to transport a cargo of 170 African human beings who are categorized as cargo, as economic commodities. So I am the banker who is giving him a loan to finance his acquisition of this cargo that he's going to get from the coast of Africa, and then he's going to sell on the in the Caribbean or wherever at a profit, and then I'm going to reap a profit off of that. In my opinion, those are the worst racists in the world. Those are the people who have managed to completely transcend the concept of linking their actions to the outcomes of their actions. They are beyond caring. They see everything in the world as something, as an entry on a spreadsheet. Everything can be financialized, everything can be capitalized, everything can be quantified and measured in capitalist or in monetary terms. So the people who sit down today at the World Economic Forum and I don't know if you've seen that popular viral video going around, and the lady is talking about how people should stop seeing land and air as free commodities, or as that land and water and air should not be seen as human rights, that they should be recorded as economic inputs on a ledger. You can Google this, right? It's a statement that was made at the recent WF meeting in Davos. In my opinion, those are the worst types of racists in the world. So you can't really separate the economic side of it from the social side of it. In fact, the economics generally controls the social side of it.
So many people believe that, sometimes we say that because of what happened with the colonization, slavery, everything, that kind of destabilized our countries. But then many people believe that, by now we should have just gotten over it and picked up and, fixed everything in our country. But with everything you're saying, with the way these different countries are working behind scene, it's almost like there's no way for us to actually succeed, especially in Nigeria.
It's not that there's no way. It's that to succeed, you first of all have to know what you are fighting against. Because the people who make those statements like, oh, we need to get over it, we need to stop blaming the white man, we need to take responsibility and stop blaming other people and the other. I used to be one of those idiots, right? There is literally a TED talk that I delivered as recently as 2020 or 2021, where I said something to the effect of, Africans are always looking for somebody to blame. They're always looking down instead of looking up. That's whether or not there's somebody who is trying to stop Africans from moving ahead in the world doesn't matter. That the only thing that matters is what Africans do, not what somebody else is doing, which is, in hindsight, is just a fundamentally foolish statement to make. Because if you don't even understand the problem that you are dealing with, what do you mean that you are trying to fix anything? What do you know that you are fixing? Right? So the people need to first of all understand the system that we are in to begin with. So before you start wasting your energy on what looks like a solution, you have to understand what the problem is. That's the fundamental issue. That was where I used to get it wrong, right? Nobody cares how much personal agency you have, how fired up you are, how much zeal you have, how much of a new African you think you are. Those things are not important because you are not the first person to have those ideas. People have had those ideas for hundreds of years, and they've all failed for the same fundamental reason, because you don't know what the hell you're actually up against. So if you say that you want to move forward in the world, you first of all have to understand how you came to be at the back of the class in the first place. How did you come to be there? Is something keeping you there? What is that something that is or is not keeping you there? You have to have that basic fundamental background information. So in this case, something as simple as your entire news media is owned by an entity from a foreign country. Is that something that you should not be concerned about? Because if your country's entire information space is under the control of a foreign entity, basically the US government has more media reach in Nigeria than the Nigerian government. Like, a foreign government has greater access to the eyes and ears of Nigerians than the Nigerian government or than any Nigerian entity. Is that not a problem?
It is.
Because essentially what that means is that you are absolutely at the mercy of this extraneous entity. So if you don't have a problem with that, that is the same thing as you saying that you expect this extraneous entity to always fundamentally have your interests at heart and to never act against your interests, because it's in control of you. Now, scale that times 100, make it your civil society space. Who is funding your entire civil society space? So be that your civil society organizations and your civil liberty organizations, your NGOs, your, all these organizations in the non-profit space. Who is funding all of them? Where does the money come from? What agenda is guiding all of them? I'll give you an example of some of how this works. So I was speaking to someone a couple of years ago who told me that, so he's a landlord in Maiduguri, the capital of Borno State. And he said in I think it was 2013 or 2014, he said that he would, one of these like conflict NGOs, these NGOs that specialize in dealing in conflict zones, they are delivering relief materials, they deal with IDPs, all that stuff, right? That they reached out to him and they said that they wanted to rent. He had a house that he had that was on the rental market, and they wanted to rent his building, and they offered to pay for 10 years upfront, which means that this NGO knew that for the next 10 years at least, we are going to be on ground. Why would an NGO know that? That for the next 10 years, there's going to be a disturbance in this place, where a full-scale disturbance hasn't even broken out yet. Yeah, and people are looking forward to whatever is happening now being, quelled within the next few weeks. And then you have an NGO coming up to you in 2013 and telling you that they want to pay for your building for the next 10 years. And then it actually turned out that over the next 10 years, that crisis got exponentially worse every year. What does that tell you? And then this NGO's funding, as usual, is coming from Washington. What does that tell you? So you first of all need to know the direction that your problem is coming from before you try and solve it. Otherwise, you will end up doing what we've been doing, which is wasting our energy on an unending series of cul-de-sacs and waste of our time. So I would say that even 2023, even though I have no regrets for taking the political positions that I took in 2023, I would say that the whole, we're going to vote out APC and Peter Obi is blah, blah, that in hindsight was a cul-de-sac. The only useful thing that came out of it for me was that I confirmed once and for all that the system is designed to not work. And that the people who are playing within the system, they are part of the system. Right? It was a cul-de-sac as far as I'm concerned, because at the end of it all, by the way, this should, I hope somebody that doesn't go and grab a clip of this and post it on the internet and say, oh, David Hundeyin is criticizing Peter Obi or something. That is not the point of what I'm saying. I'm making a much wider point that because of that lack of understanding of what the problem actually is, we kept misdiagnosing what the issue is and looking for solutions in all the wrong places. And I was guilty of that too. So I was looking for a solution in 2023 from the Nigerian electoral system, which it was clearly never going to come from, because obviously Peter Obi was never, ever, ever, even though obviously everybody and their dog knows that he won the election, but he was never going to be Nigerian president. It was just never going to happen. And that hasn't changed. Be it 2027, be it 2031, as long as the current system persists, somebody who has any sort of baseline of integrity or honesty or accountability or governance capacity or economic literacy, whatever it is that you are looking for in a leader, that person is never going to be declared winner. Because the system that is in control of Nigerian elections has decreed it so. That's why Muhammadu Buhari will win 2 terms in Nigeria. Muhammadu Buhari, one of the biggest morons that Nigeria has ever produced, he won 2 terms in office. He became Nigeria's longest serving, the person who has ruled Nigeria for the longest amount of time, cumulatively 10 years. Nobody else has managed that in Nigerian history. But one of the dumbest people in Nigerian history managed it. That's not by accident. And that's why after Buhari went, you will get a drug dealer. And then after that one goes, who knows, maybe you end up with, and I don't know what to be next. Because it has gone from illiterate dons to drug trafficker. Who knows what the next level is beneath that? So instead of looking for solutions based on this exaggerated sense of personal agency and bravado, stop blaming white people, blah, 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 take responsibility. Before you take responsibility, you need to know what it is you are taking responsibility for. Where exactly are you, first of all? So that you don't end up deluding yourself and thinking that you are fighting something when you are actually... And I'm saying this because that was what happened to me. That's why I keep saying 2023 was my morning, because after devoting all that time and all that energy and all that conviction and putting myself in real physical danger, I had to leave where I was so many times. I was living under armed protection at the start of 2023. I was living in a safe house that was being operated by my friend Anas, Arameyaw Anas. I was literally living under armed protection. There were people walking outside holding, machine guns. That's how I was living. My movement was restricted, all because I was doing journalism work. I didn't commit any crime. But I was so fired up because I thought that I have found the solution. The solution is that somebody needs to hold Nigerian leaders accountable, and I'm going to be that person. And I was willing to light myself on fire for it. And I did light myself on fire. And at the end of the day, what came of it? And then I found myself in US federal court, right? I'm suing the US government over these issues, right? Like, why is this information not in the public domain? Why is this information being hidden? Why is it being redacted? And the US government is blatantly protecting this person. And in the space of a few weeks is when my entire worldview comes crashing down, because then I realized that the idea that these people were ever benign or on your side, or they somehow didn't care. Oh, Nigeria is not that important. Oh, they are not involved in Nigeria's interests, blah, blah, blah. I realized complete nonsense. Nigeria is that important. Africa is that important. And they are absolutely invested, and they're absolutely involved in everything that is happening, up to and including knocking off, actually physically assassinating your heads of states and your presidents. Because, newsflash, that is how Sani Abacha died. Sani Abacha did not die of a poisoned apple from an Indian prostitute or all those tales by moonlight that they told us, right? He was assassinated by the CIA. That is what happened. And which is why as soon as he died, he never received an autopsy, which is weird for a sitting president who died. They buried him 5 minutes later, and an autopsy was never performed. And the excuse that was given was that he was a Muslim. That's the reality of the existence that we are in. So this idea that, we are this sovereign entity and we're just blaming other people. We are not a sovereign entity, my dear. People are involved in every aspect of your nation's decision making. A few months ago, when there was a National Assembly hearing about modifying the Nigerian Constitution, a National Assembly hearing about rewriting the Nigerian Constitution. What flags were you seeing at that National Assembly hearing? What logos were you seeing? You were seeing UK8 with the Union Jack. You were seeing plaque, which is funded by the MacArthur Foundation, basically CIA front. That's what you were seeing there. People working for foreign intelligence, people working for the GCHQ and the CIA were involved in rewriting your country's constitution. And you are saying, stop blaming white people. Are you not stupid? That means you don't know the direction that your problem is coming from at all. So people need to understand the place that they live in, right? The information that the news media, let me not say the information, the news media that you have access to around you, your channels, TVs, and your AITs, and your Premium Time, and your Punch newspaper, and Guardian newspaper, and your Cool FM, and all these things are part of a carefully curated information cage to keep you unaware and keep you stupid. Some of the people who work in these spaces actually know. I speak to some of them, and I can tell you for a fact, there are things they are not allowed to cover. There are topics they are not allowed to touch. There are places they are not allowed to go in their coverage. Because the remit is that their job is primarily keep you stupefied, keep you over-entertained, which is why there's this inordinate obsession with entertainment in Nigeria, a country where the per capita GDP is struggling to reach $1,000 per annum. And there is so much obsession with entertainment. And you are wondering, what are you people feeling so entertained about? What is there to celebrate? It's not by accident. It's not organic. It's not local. These are instructions that are coming from the places that the money is coming from. So people need to understand first and foremost that they are inside a cage. And that even by African standards, the Nigerian situation is extremely critical. It's very, very bad. And I'll just quickly close with this, that I've noticed that a lot of Nigerians who have not left Nigeria before, or maybe when they left Nigeria, they went to the UK or the US, and they only just shuttle between Nigeria and somewhere outside Africa. They don't realize how far the rest of Africa has left Nigeria behind. They don't realize that I mean, if you drive 400 kilometers from Lagos, 400 kilometers east to Accra, the standard of living that a child growing up in Teshi Nungwa, which is like the Ajegunle of Accra, has, is like 3 or 4 levels above the standard of living of his counterpart in Lagos. Like, there is such a gap, there is such a chasm that is developing already. Many Nigerians are not aware of this. Many Nigerians still walk around with this idea that Nigeria is some giant of Africa, or that other countries are somehow looking up to Nigeria. They have no idea how bad it really is, and how much worse it's going to get. So people need to wake up and start understanding that decline of the national entity that began from 2015 was completely engineered, it was completely deliberate, and it's still ongoing. It hasn't stopped. It's accelerating, it's getting worse. And I think I'll just close with that.
All you said is really is demotivating, because it makes me ask the question, what are we supposed to do? It almost seems like there's nothing we can do, like we're a destroyed nation.
So I think I've been getting asked the variation of this question every time I do a public appearance for like the past 3 years or so. And the problem I have with this question is that, first of all, I think we all, deep down, we all know exactly what it is that we should do, that we ought to do. We all know deep down. And I feel like every time I'm asked this question, it puts me in this very weird situation where I then have to be the one that now, somebody's going to end up taking a clip, like a sound bite of this, and it's going to end up like David Hundeyin advocates for regicide. And then that potentially puts me in trouble even where I am, because, then some person in Abuja can then make another phone call to some person wherever and say, oh, this person is being troublesome, blah, blah, blah. And then where I am, somebody can then give me a call and say, you are putting us in a tight diplomatic situation. We have a good diplomatic relationship with Nigeria, and you are making it difficult for us. Now, if you want us to be able to protect you, you need to basically disengage, which has happened to me before. So I'm not going to, again, I think I've lit myself on fire for Nigeria and for Nigerians enough times over the past 3 years. I'm not going to light myself on fire one more time. What I will just say is that everybody who is able to link cause and effect, and who is able to add 2 and 2 to make 4, and who is able to understand that the current system will only keep on producing the results that it has been producing for the past 11 years, that person will figure out very rapidly that, when I say that the system needs to be torn down and something needs to be put up in its place, it's up to everyone to figure out what torn down means to them individually.
Yeah.
If to them it means an election, good for you. If to you it means electronic transmission of vote results, good for you. If to you it means going out on the streets and doing protests, good for you. If it means, whatever it means to you, good for you. But I think deep down, we all know the things that need to be done. We all know the people who are responsible for the current status quo. And we all know the extent to which those people are prepared to go to maintain the status quo. And we know the things that have to be done to get those people out of the way if the status quo is to be changed. So I will leave it to anyone watching to make their own minds up. But I'm not going to create a situation where somebody's going to take a clip, devoid of context, post it on Twitter, and then it goes viral. David Hundeyin is advocating for Nigerians to go out onto the streets, put tire on Tinubu's neck, and burn him to crisp. I'm not doing that. So,
because of time, I've just got 3 more questions for you. My first question is, a lot of people have been talking about the 2030 agenda, but what does that mean for Nigeria or for Africa?
The only thing we need to know is that whether it's whatever name they use for it, Agenda 2025, Agenda 2030, is the same agenda that has existed since the 1600s. And the agenda is basically that Africa should be maintained in a specific role for the benefit of Western hegemony. And that role is cheap extraction or even free extraction of raw materials, natural resources, and agricultural inputs. And maybe to a lesser extent, if there's any requirement for it, cheap labor. And labor doesn't necessarily mean compensated work. Labor can also be something like sex, sex slaves. That's also a form of cheap labor. The same things that have been done to Africans for hundreds of years are what the same people are planning to do to Africans all over again. The only difference between then and now is that there exists some capacity for pushback due to the rise of Russia and China as strategic counterbalances, and the fact that the existence of Russia and China has given Africa the measure of relative freedom and economic growth that it manages to have right now. Because in case people are not aware of this, I will say this very, very clearly. The economic rise of China from absolute, poverty and being nowhere to becoming the largest economy in the world has coincided almost perfectly with the population explosion of Africa from under 500 million to being close to 2 billion today. That is not by accident. The two things have a very clear and direct link. Ditto, the change of Africa from being this completely colonized entity that had countries and towns and cities named after Europeans to being an entity that, even though it's still under some form of colonialism, at least has its own political, insignias, has its own flags, has indigenized to a certain extent, and Black people actually own land. That only exists because of the strategic existence of the USSR during the Cold War. So if you watched the speech that was made by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a couple of days ago in Germany, he basically said very clearly that, look, for 400 years, the Western Empire was expanding. But from 1945, it started shrinking because of communism. He specifically said communism and anti-colonial uprisings made the Western Empire start shrinking. And he openly said that that was a bad thing. And that with your help, the US and Europe, they want to recolonize, essentially, Africa and the global South because they think it's a good thing. He said, and I quote, "We need our partners to not be burdened by guilt or shame." He's saying the quiet part out loud, right? So basically what has been done to Africa for all these hundreds of years was only a temporary reversal, a temporary pushback that was created by the existence of the USSR, Russia, and China. And now the project of this Western Empire is how to strategically eliminate the threats of the USSR, of the threat of Russia and China, or if it cannot eliminate them and it has to accept that those ones have their own sphere of influence that it cannot destroy, then how to make sure that it can grab as much of the so-called global South, i.e. Africa, as possible. And that is why you are seeing, the US setting up a military base in Nigeria now, US troops. It's very obvious what is happening. It's recolonization. It's the world being reconfigured. And some power blocks, which feel like they've been pushed out of the places that used to be their own, are trying to reestablish power bases in those places. And unfortunately, because in Nigeria, we don't know our ass from our elbow, we are spreading our legs and letting them in. Like, yay, you're coming to fight the terrorists for us. Yay, Jack Bauer. So, yeah.
My second to the last question. What are your predictions for the 2027 elections?
My prediction is that regardless of who wins, regardless of who people vote for, regardless of whatever happens, on May 29, 2027, when the swearing-in oath has just been taken, then the military marching band that is playing, that plays the national anthem and whatnot, when they're done playing the national anthem, next thing you're going to hear is, "On your mandate, we shall stand." Or maybe you hear that before you hear the national anthem. That's my prediction for 2027.
Wow. So you're basically saying all the noise and everything that we've been making online is not going to make any change.
Absolutely not. Look, the minute 200 US soldiers touched down in Nigeria, and you heard that the US government is establishing a drone base in northern Nigeria, Tinubu won 2027. And I'm not going to bother myself to explain how. Whoever doesn't get it now probably isn't ever going to get it. So,
My final question is, with everything you've seen come out with the Epstein files and, people eating babies and sacrificing children and everything, does this change your non-belief in God?
so it's very funny that you asked this question. I wish there was there's a video I saw a few days ago. I wish I could have played it here. And it's essentially because it ties in so well with how I think. The number one thing people need to understand about religions is that religions are all fundamentally man-made things. Religions are all created by men. And when I say men, I literally mean men, as in males. Because a religion, first and foremost, is a construct of power. The entire purpose of religion is to formalize a power structure. That's what religion exists to do. Religion in and of itself is a political entity. It has a power structure. It has people who are on top. It has a governing class, and then it has the masses who are being controlled. That is the basic structure of any religion created by any human civilization anywhere on earth at any point in time. All religions share that basic structure. So the gods and deities that exist in religions are merely part of that story that was told, right? So you might see, they're sacrificing babies to Moloch or whatever. It doesn't mean that Moloch is an actual thing that exists, but it's what it represents. Think about it. What is the most abominable thing it is possible for a human to do on this earth? The most abominable thing that a human can do is to knowingly hurt a child. That is the most abominable thing that exists. There's nothing you can do that is more abominable than that, right? It's to knowingly hurt a child, right? Like murder or rape a child. There's nothing that is worse than that as far as human society goes. So if people are willing to ritually murder and abuse children in groups to observe each other while they do it without any form of censure or consequences or backlash or anything whatsoever, what that then means is that at that level, that the rules that apply to the rest of society do not apply. That the people doing this thing see themselves as having transcended the rules of society. So they see the rest of society the way you might see a colony of ants. Wow. So you might step on a group of ants and you might murder a bunch of their babies, but you don't think you've done anything wrong because they are just ants. They are beneath you. That is how these people see the rest of human society, as beneath them. So the ritual that shows that they have transcended society and that they are above the constructs of the people who are beneath them is that they can do the things that are considered by those beneath them to be the worst things you can do without experiencing any consequences, without feeling any shame. So you kill a child, for example. So that's the point of such rituals. It's not about the deity, which they then use to personify. That thing is just a construct, it's just a tool of power. It's just a story that is told. The main thing is the ritual itself and what it represents. So, again, when it comes to the wider Epstein conversation, I wish people weren't so focused just on the salacious details. Oh, this person raped that person, this person sacrificed a child, this person used to eat human meat and call it jerky. There are all sorts of shocking details in there, yes, we know. But for me, the more important details in those files that almost everyone seems to be completely glossing over is that those files lay out The reality that was once something that was thought of as conspiracy theory. When people used to say it's that, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, the reality that the people who actually govern the world, who actually make the decisions in the world, are not people you see in front of you as prime minister, house member of House of Parliament, House of Representatives, minister of this and that, president this and that. That those are not the real decision makers. That there is a shadow government. Because that is what you see when you look through those files. You see who the real government of the world is. Where you see, for example, how, let me use Nigeria as a case in point. The Lekki deep sea port and the Badagry deep sea port, right? How did those two projects come into existence? And you realize that it wasn't that, oh, there was it was one Nigerian Ministry of Works and Infrastructure, Works and Housing, or Ministry of Transportation or whatever that came up with this idea, and then a bill was passed. That's not what actually happened. That what actually happened was that a guy, an oligarch in Dubai, Sultan bin Zulayem, whatever his name is, who owns DP World, who was looking to expand his global empire of ports, took a look at the map and decided that Lagos is prime for his expansion, for his global expansion. And then he made a call, and then he was hooked up with Jeffrey Epstein, who facilitated his engagement with the Lagos state government via some guy called Jide Zetlin, whoever the hell that is. So the conversation that was happening in your local Nigerian media about Badagry Deep Sea Port and Lekki Deep Sea Port, somebody was campaigning and holding broom and saying, we'll build a port here, blah, blah, blah. That person was not the person who was in control of that project or who made any of the decisions. It had nothing to do with him. He was as much of a spectator as you and I are. That the real government that makes decisions is controlled by this hidden infrastructure that you cannot see. It's people like Jeffrey Epstein. That's what you see when you look through those files. That Jeffrey Epstein was a switchboard. He was a command center that was linking the real global elite with the things that they wanted to do wherever in the world that they wanted to do those things. So whether it was kidnapping black children to go and hunt them for sport on one island, or whether it's investing in a port, or whether it's buying this asset somewhere, Jeffrey Epstein is your plug that will hook you up. And that was the real person who is really in charge, not whoever you elected. And then the other thing you see in those files is that the few countries that were outside of the control of this global network were China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And then you start to understand why the media and information ecosystem that is owned by this network never has anything good to say about China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Yeah. And then they will come to you in Nigeria and tell you that China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran are terrible places. So that's what I wish people would take away from that's the real takeaway from the Epstein files. It's not the fact that they did terrible things, which, I mean, who didn't know that? The real issue is that this is actually the world government. These are actually the people who are in charge. These are the people who control your president. These are the people that your president answers to. These are the people who put your presidents in power. Like, that is them. That is the global infrastructure, the hidden global infrastructure that you are looking at. And we're lucky enough to live at a time when these things are no longer things that are spoken about in terms of suspicion or conspiracy. That they are now things that you can refer to on public record in black and white and see everything in very clear detail and understand how the world really works.
Thank you so much, David. I'll just squeeze one last question in there, if you don't mind. The shadow government, many people believe it's Israel.
Okay, and?
Do you have the same thoughts?
Who says it can't be both? Who says there's any contradiction between there being a global network of rich white men who control everything, and that global network being overwhelmingly dominated by Israelis or Jewish people? There's no contradiction between the two. We're saying the same thing.
Thank you very much, David. It's been great having you back for a second time. Do you have any final words?
I don't think I do. This has been like 2 hours now. My mouth is literally hurting. I need to go home and have it lie down. But yeah, just follow the Spearhead if you don't already. This is for the Nigerian audience. So it's at Spearhead_AF. That's Spearhead Africa. So we're on all the social media platforms. So just give the Spearhead a follow. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right then.